This is what I was telling you, Agent Mulder. This is the hoax into which you've been drawn. The roots go back 50 years to the end of World War II. Playing on a virulent national appetite for bogus revelation and a public newly fearful of something called the atom bomb, the U.S. military command began to fan the flames of what were being called flying saucer stories. There are truths which can kill a nation, Agent Mulder. The military needed something to deflect attention away from its arms strategy. Global domination through the capability of total enemy annihilation. The nuclear card was fine as long as we alone could play it, but the generals and politicals knew what they could not win was a public relations war. Those photos from Nagasaki and Hiroshima were not faces Americans wanted to see in a mirror. Oppenheimer knew it, of course, but we silenced him. When the Russians developed the bomb, the fear in the military was not for safety at home, but for armistice and treaty. The business of America isn't business, Agent Mulder, it's war. Since Antietam, nothing has driven the economy faster. We needed a reason to keep spending money, and when there wasn't a war to justify it, we called it war anyway. The Cold War was essentially a 50-year public relations battle, a pitched game of chicken against an enemy we not much more than called names. The communists called us a few names, too. We will bury you, Khrushchev said. And the public believed it. After what McCarthy had done to the country, they ate it with a big spoon. We squared off a few times in Cuba, Korea, and Vietnam, but nobody dropped the bomb. Nobody dared.
What does any of this have to do with flying saucers?
The U.S. military saw a good thing in '47 when the Roswell story broke. The more we denied it, the more people believed it was true. Aliens had landed. A made-to-order cover story for generals looking to develop the national war chest. They opened official investigations with names like Grudge, Twinkle, Project Blue Book, Majestic 12. They brought in college professors and congressmen and fed them enough bogus fact, enough fuzzy photos and eyewitness accounts that they believed it too. They'd even hooked Doug MacArthur, for God's sake. I can't tell you how fortuitous the timing of it all was. Do you know when the first supersonic flight was, Agent Mulder? 1947. Soon every experimental aircraft being flown was a UFO sighting. When the abduction story started up, it was too perfect. We'd almost gotten caught in Korea, an ambitious misstep. China and the Soviets knew it. The UN got all heated up at us.
Germ warfare. We were accused of using it on the Koreans.
It was developmental then, nothing like what we and the Russians have now.
And all these reports of abductions, you're saying they've all been lies?
You've heard the recent denials about Roswell by the military and the CIA. And what's been the effect? Even wilder and more widespread belief. The American appetite for bogus revelation, Agent Mulder.
But I've seen aliens. I've witnessed these things.
You've seen what they wanted you to see. The line between science and science fiction doesn't exist anymore. What this is about is control of the very elements of life. DNA, yours, mine, everyone's.
Germans turn to a new technology, the jet fighter. Professor Willy Messerschmitt's top-secret project, the Me-262, a twin-engine turbojet fighter whose performance will eclipse anything in the sky. Incredibly, the brilliant design has been on the drawing board for 4 years before it is seen as urgent. The Me-262, the fastest plane yet flown by man, is presented to Adolf Hitler. Germany will have an unbeatable fighter.
Episode 4 of the History Channel's show Unidentified Inside America's UFO Investigation centers around 3 videos, commonly referred to as Nimitz, Go Fast, and Gimbal. All 3 videos were extensively analysed on Metabunk over a year ago. Nimitz is probably just a distant jet. Gimbal is also probably a distant jet, but this time with a rotating glare that's just an artifact of the gimbal-mounted camera system. But what I want to discuss here is the Go Fast video. This video appears to show an object flying very close to the water, which is how it's presented on Unidentified.
That thing is hauling
That's
ass.
exactly my point.
It's a little less than 2/3 the speed of sound.
This description is repeated on the To the Stars Academy page, where the video was first released. A white oval shape moving at high speed, flying very low over the water. But is it really low and fast? No, it's not. There's a bunch of numbers on screen. The altitude of the jet is pretty constant at 25,000 feet. The calibrated airspeed in the lower left is also fairly constant at around 255 knots, which gives a true airspeed of 370 knots when you correct for the 25,000 feet pressure altitude. The jet is flying straight at first, but after locking on, it banks about 13 degrees to the left. I extracted this information by feature tracking the ends of the horizon line, so the jet's turning a little bit to the left. The number at the top is the angle of the camera relative to the front of the jet. It goes from 35 degrees left to 58 degrees left. The number in the middle left is the camera's downward tilt. It goes from 22 degrees down to 35 degrees down. One of the more important numbers here is the range number, on the right-hand side, labelled RNG. This is the distance to the target in nautical miles. It does not show up until the target is acquired, but then it goes from 4.4 nautical miles to 3.3 nautical miles. So we can use all these numbers and how they change over time to do 2 things. Firstly, we can calculate how high the object is. That isn't too complicated. We know the angle the camera is looking down at, and we know the distance to the object. So the height of the object below the camera is really just simple trigonometry. It's the range multiplied by the sine of the downward angle. If you take the object at the start and the end of the tracking, we get 4.4 nautical miles times the sine of 26 degrees gives us 1.92 nautical miles below the plane. Then at the end, 3.4 nautical miles times the sine of 35 degrees gives us 1.95 nautical miles, about the same. Then it's an object that's around 13,000 feet above the water. And it's also being viewed from a jet at 25,000 feet. So basically it's halfway between the jet and the ocean surface. This is very important, because it means the perceived motion of the object against the ocean surface, even if it were moving very slowly, or even if it were not moving at all, would be the same as the speed of the jet itself. This parallax effect is hugely magnified by the high zoom, which is set to NAR, narrow, or around 1.5 degrees field of view. So, we've already seen the unidentified analysis is wrong. It's not close to the water at all. It's at 13,000 feet. But is it, as they say,
It's hauling
That's
ass.
exactly my point.
It's a little less than 2/3 the speed of sound.
hauling ass and 2/3 the speed of sound? No, it's not even close. It's going as slow as 20 to 40 knots. Just wind speed at that altitude. We can determine this with some slightly more complex analysis. So we know that the jet and the object maintain constant altitudes. The object at 13,000 feet, the jet at 26,000 feet. So we can restrict the analysis of the speed of the object to an overhead view. Now, given the range and the angle relative to the front of the jet, we can plot an initial position for that object relative to the jet. Then we know the speed of the jet and the time of the locked portion of the video, so we can plot where it will be at the end of the video. Then using the final range and the angles, we can plot the end position of the object. We can then divide this distance traveled by the time and we get the speed of the object. This depends on how much the jet is turning to the left, but putting in a reasonable turn rate and we get the object speeds in the range of 20 to 40 knots, maybe a bit more, but it's all consistent with wind speed of 13,000 feet. Not another jet, and certainly not 2/3 the speed of sound. We can also make a rough estimate of the size of the object based on the field of view, the range, and the fraction of the field of view covered by the object. This gives us a size of about 6 or 7 feet, about the size of, say, a weather balloon. In Unidentified, they notice that the craft appears cold on the infrared, and the narrator says,
"There is no known aircraft that can stay aloft for long without a source of lift and propulsion."
which is false, because there's an obvious type of aircraft, a helium balloon, which appears cold in infrared and can stay aloft for hours, even days. It can also look like it's moving really fast over the ground when it's actually just parallax. Here's another example where a balloon is clearly just a balloon, it's also barely moving, and it looks like it's moving really fast. Balloons themselves don't reflect radar, but weather balloons carry radar reflectors, which will be very easy for the range-finding radar to lock onto. And finally, in the Defense Department's Form 1910 that authorized public release of this video, the description specifically mentions balloons. Does this solve this one particular video? Not 100%, but it's a quite plausible answer that people are ignoring. Maybe they just didn't do the math, maybe they didn't like the answer, but you can't ignore it as a possibility. If this actually was a real object 10 miles away, and this was its actual shape, then when the plane banks, the entire scene should rotate. So if this was a real saucer-shaped craft, then it should also rotate with the horizon. Instead, it's fixed for the first 20 seconds. While it's at a fixed angle, the horizon, both the artificial horizon and the real one indicated by the clouds and the dark band above them, rotates 12 degrees in 3 steps over those first 20 seconds. This is probably the most significant of the 4 observables. You can see it simply by looking at the first 20 seconds of the video. Scrub back and forth. See the horizon rotate, but the object does not. Either something 10 plus miles away is precisely mirroring the exact small changes in the bank angle of a random jet, or it's an artifact of the camera. The second observable is bumps before rotation. Whenever the target rotates, we see just before this a little bump of the entire scene. This can be seen in the original video, but it's clearer if we use OpenCV to calculate a velocity field for the video. We see the motion of the clouds shift up a bit with the bump before the rotation starts. This means that there's a camera motion just before the object's apparent rotation. So either the object is zapping the plane with energy from 10 miles away just before it decides to rotate, or it's an artifact of the camera. The third observable is rotating patterns. When the object, the glare, rotates, we also see patterns of light in the background of the image rotate. This is easier to see if you cover the glare. They move in sync with the glare's rotation, even when the jet is not banking. This can really only be explained as an artifact of the camera. Finally, there's the incredible synchronicity between the calculated roll, the white line, and the roll that's simply the same as the angle of the glare, the green line. For the first 20 seconds, they were within about 2 degrees, no need to adjust. But at about 23 seconds, we get over 2.5 degrees away, and there's a small roll to correct. This happens again at 26 seconds, and then at 28.5 seconds it happens again. But this time, before the correction ends, there's a roll of the jet in a clockwise direction, which means the pod needs to rotate more in the counterclockwise direction, so we get this long correction until the jet stops banking. Then there's one more correction like the others, and finally we end just before another correction would be needed. So if this isn't a glare, then we've got an object over 10 miles away, probably 30, that somehow rotates when the jet rotates, so it stays fixed in the camera's frame. It's an object that somehow bumps the camera before it rotates from 10 plus miles away. It's an object that somehow projects rotating light patterns that rotate with it. It's an object that rotates in a way that matches exactly the amount needed to stay within 3 degrees of a gimbal system tracking the target while minimizing roll, but just from this one plane at this pitch and this bank angle. Or it's a glare, rotating because of the gimbal system in a video titled Gimbal. This isn't fudging the numbers or mental gymnastics. This is an open source simulation that you can try yourself. It's at metabunk.org/gimbal. The data was all extracted from the Navy videos, and you can verify that. There's extensive discussion threads on Metabunk about all of this, where I discuss what I'm showing here, and you can see the process of discovery and figuring stuff out. This is the Nimitz UFO footage, also called FLIR or Tic Tac. To understand the footage, you've got to know that there's actually two cameras being used, and the video switches between them, as well as switching zoom levels. It starts out in infrared mode, where white is hot, and we can see a shimmering heat source. 18 seconds in, they switch to the TV camera, which is just visible light. We can just see a blurry shape in the distance. At 41 seconds, it switches back to infrared, and we'll discuss that later. But for now, I'm going to focus on the TV footage, the visible light image. Here we see a dark blob, wider than it is high, and initially a little like a Tic Tac or caplet shape. But over 20 seconds, it gets larger as the jet gets closer, and the shape shifts a bit, almost as if it's rotating about the vertical axis. It becomes a little more peanut-shaped, and a kind of tail seems to appear on the left. So what is it? I think it's a distant plane, flying at a bit of an angle to the jet and slightly above it. We know the camera's angled up at around 5 degrees at the start. But how can a plane look like a black blob? Well, we know planes can look very dark when backlit. And we know things tend to look like blobs when they're far away, especially in low-resolution blurry footage. So let's take a plane and see what it looks like, backlit in low-resolution blurry footage. Here's a typical passenger jet, a Boeing 767. If it's backlit, it would look more like this. Of course, what we're seeing is out of focus, so a bit more like this. And not only is it out of focus, but it's also low resolution, so let's do that too. Finally, there's a bunch of noise in the video. Let's have a look at that. So now we've got a simulated visible light image of a distant jet at various angles. We can see that from this angle, it looks a bit like the UFO at the start of the TV segment. And from this angle, it looks a bit like it does at the end of the segment, with a more peanut-like shape and the hint of a tail to the left. So if this is all we had to go by, I'd say this fits pretty well. So maybe the Nimitz video is just a distant passenger plane. But what about the infrared footage? That's showing the heat from the engines. And we saw in the Chilean Navy UFO case that the glare from the engines can hide the shape of the plane. At the start of the video, the Nimitz infrared glare doesn't have a good shape, as the plane is so far away. Later we see more of a horizontal shape, similar to the black shape in the TV footage, but smaller. By the way, this case, the Chilean Navy UFO, is a great example of how experts get things wrong. The pilots thought they were looking at something small and close, but it was just a large passenger plane over 80 miles away. They then spent 2 years investigating it, and eventually declared it a genuine unidentified, only to have it identified a week later by people on the internet, including me. Here's some infrared video of a 767, shot from the front, getting closer to the camera. Like in the Nimitz video, at first it just looks like a dot of light, but as it gets closer we get more of a horizontal shape as the engines separate. So it certainly could be the same thing in the Nimitz video. Unfortunately, they've cranked up the sharpening in this video, giving it a strong aura like in the gimbal video. What are the sudden movements of the UFO? They appear to all just be camera movements. There's a rotation when the camera does a gimbal lock correction around 3 degrees, and the other movements all coincide with changes in zoom. Finally, the camera does a zoom change and just does not lock back onto the object, and it drifts off as it's not being tracked. Final zoom change gives the illusion that it's moving off really fast, but if you correct for zoom, you see that it's actually not. Is it solved? No, not 100%. The fit is pretty good, but not exact. But this was just the first plane I tried. Maybe a different plane or a different camera setting will work better. But I think it shows that a distant plane is a very real possibility that should probably be at the top of the list.
Fed them enough bogus fact, enough fuzzy photos, and eyewitness accounts that they believed it too.
This is the Nimitz UFO footage, also called FLIR or Tic Tac. It's less interesting looking than the rotating gimbal footage, but it gets a lot of interest because of the testimony of Commander David Fravor, who describes a bizarre encounter with a 40-foot Tic Tac shaped craft that ran rings around him before shooting off at hypersonic speeds. This video is not of that incident. It was shot shortly later by a different pilot in the same group.
Oh, and when you talk to, Lou Elizondo or Chris Mellon, the group at TTSA, that whole
What's
thing
TTSA?
That's To the Stars Academy.
Okay.
That's the Tom DeLong group that got started. So, and you go, well, because I think Tom has caught a lot of crap for this, but he's actually, when you talk to him, he's very smart. So he started asking more, and through his fame with Blink-182 in the band, he got more and more connected. If you talk to Chris Mellon, who is an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and he's part of the Mellon, dynasty, from Carnegie Mellon type, very, very smart. He knows, he definitely knows how the government works because he worked there. And so when I went down to DC to talk to people, he's one of the first people I'll go to. When I did Tucker Carlson about a month and a half ago, I asked, he texted me. I texted him, Tom, Lou, to go, hey, because they were like, you got to do it. Because I'd turned Tucker down a couple times before, and his producer had called me, and I'm like, all right, I'll do it. Because those guys are like, you got to do this for us. So as we're looking around, the backseater in the other airplane comes up and says, hey, Skipper, do you see? And before he says it, I'm like, dude, do you see that? As soon as we look down, we see the whitewater, and then we see this little white Tic Tac. It's pointing north-south, and it's just going forward, back, left, right.
It's just bouncing around?
Yeah, like a ping pong ball.
What was its shape? What was its, what did it look like it was made out of?
Like a perfectly smooth white Tic Tac.
The American appetite for bogus revelation.
Hidden among the many pages of the COVID-19 bill is this mandate to produce a report on unidentified aerial phenomena. What's different this time is that the military is kind of talking about them very explicitly in terms of threats. It's not like the Pentagon's deal to call things aliens, but that's kind of the angle they're coming from.
If there is a foreign adversary, let's say Russian or China or anybody else, who happens to have this technology and they've had it for decades, and we in the United States have somehow been strategically leapfrogged in our technology, we've got a big problem on our hands.
Officially, the clause attached to December's COVID-19 relief bill, added by the Senate Intelligence Committee, calls for the military and FBI to brief committee members on what they know about UAPs within 180 days of the bill's passing. The kind of top-level briefings Elizondo says he's given before.
The three options are, is it our technology? Is it foreign adversarial technology or someone else's technology? Or is it something completely different? We're 99% sure it's not foreign adversarial technology. So that only leaves really one other option. It's someone or something else.
Are these three videos the only videos that you know of that the United States government has that shows unidentified aerial phenomena?
No, absolutely not. These are probably some of the least compelling videos. In some cases, we've seen these things 50 feet away from the cockpit.
And when you're talking about something that is 50 feet away, I mean, what could they tell from being 50 feet away?
With all due respect, Gotti, I no longer work for the United States government in that capacity. So I want to be clear that I don't want to speak on behalf of the U.S. government. And I also want to give the government time to do what it needs to do regarding this data.
A made-to-order cover story for generals looking to develop the national war chest.
He said, you will find that there is going to be a spin to find some enemy against whom we have to build space-based weapons. And now we should expect the spin, because he said part of the formula for the intelligence community is if they might have a weapon, then we have to consider that they do have these weapons. So now they do have these weapons, so now we have to build these weapon systems. And that's the formula.
My new national strategy for space recognizes that space is a warfighting domain, just like the land, air, and sea. We may even have a space force, develop another one, Space Force. We have the Air Force, we'll have the Space Force. We have the Army, the Navy. I was saying it the other day because we're doing a tremendous amount of work in space. I said, maybe we need a new force. We'll call it the Space Force. And I was not really serious. And then I said, what a great idea. Maybe we'll have to do that. That could happen.
In 1974, I was introduced to the late Dr. Werner von Braun, in the U.S., the father of rocketry. In my first meeting with him, during that first 3.5 hours, he said to me, Carol, you will stop the weaponization of space. He said, no, you have to understand, this is February, and we have to prevent the weaponization of space because there is a lie being told to everyone that the weaponization of space is now first being based upon the evil empire, the Russians. There are many enemies, he said, against whom we're going to build this space-based weapon system. The first of whom was the Russians, which was existing at that time. Then there would be terrorists. Then there would be third world countries. Now we call them rogue nations or nations of concern. Then there would be asteroids. And then he would repeat to me over and over, and the last card would be the extraterrestrial threat.
Right now, we have essentially one person. We have Dave Grush telling us that other people have told him that we have a reverse engineering program for crashed alien spacecraft, essentially, and that we have recovered alien bodies from those crashed spacecraft. And we have a very limited set of snippets of interviews with him, Dave Grush has been to the Canadian government and talked to members of Parliament of the Canadian Parliament about this thing, and a kind of a roadshow where he's been going around with people like Gary Nolan and maybe Lou Elizondo. I think the biggest problem with this, other than that these claims are outlandish and ridiculous and don't have any evidence behind them, the biggest problem with this is that these claims have been cleared by the government. This is something I mentioned on the program, but I think it's worth mentioning again in the context of what the claims actually are. There's a government body called DOPSR, the Department Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review. When you want to publish something like a TV interview or a book, and you are covered by classification, you have a security clearance, even if you've left the government, you have to go through DOPSR. And they have to look at this thing before it's published, this pre-publication, and do a security review. So they've got to look at it and they've got to see, does this reveal any classified information? And so they looked at everything he said. They looked at things and they said, oh yeah, okay, so he's claiming that the US government is killing people. He's claiming that aliens are killing people. He's claiming that there might be a secret agreement with aliens. He's claiming we have all these alien craft and we've been reverse engineering it, and we've been illegally giving this technology to industry. This is another thing he said. We've been illegally giving this technology to industry and allowing them to exploit it and then sell it back to the government and make loads of money. And this is going on. This is fine. This is all fine. This is not secret. This is not secret. DOPSR has cleared everything that he has said. So none of this stuff is secret. Which kind of begs the question, why has nobody mentioned this before?